Who knows what's going on? All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the House Judiciary Committee. It is the 12th of March. It's a little after 2. We have one bill. It's in my name, but really it's an administration bill because they may have been slightly delayed in bringing it to the committee's attention. House Bill 1499, if you want to come up, Mr. Secretary, and present on the bill, that would be fine. Secretary Lopez is here. Don't know if you need anybody else. I know you've got a couple people with you, but
I have a posse in case I really screw up.
all right, well, that's good.
But
I find that helpful.
I'm going to give it my best because I do know the subject.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Good afternoon, Chair Clippinger and honorable members of the House Judiciary Committee. I'm Rafael Lopez and I serve as the Secretary of the Department of Human Services. The Moore Miller administration is driven by 12 core values, and among these are being data-driven and heart-led, reminding us to rely on data and lived experiences to lead our work. House Bill 1499 establishes a research-informed framework for our kin-first approach to out-of-home placements that will improve outcomes for children and youth experiencing foster care. Kinship care is the full-time care, nurturing, and protection of children by family members, close family friends, or other important adults in a child's life. Family connection is one of the most important contributions to children's development. Family connections help children grow and thrive, providing resources of belonging, stability and security, identity, culture, and community. To support such family connections, we are moving urgently forward to build a kin-first culture throughout our department and throughout the state. Kin-first policies promote a holistic framework of child well-being grounded in science and research. Research repeatedly demonstrates that placing a child with their own family and kin reduces the trauma of removal from a child's home, increases the likelihood that children will remain with their siblings, increases permanency by providing stability with fewer placement disruptions, improves children's behavioral and mental health outcomes, reduces the risk that children in out-of-home care are trafficked, and maintains family, community, and cultural ties that function as protective factors for children throughout their lives. Ongoing child development research continues to reveal that the psychology of childhood bonding and attachment are far more expansive than previously understood. Research is demonstrating what we know intuitively. The whole psychosocial environment matters to a child's psychological health. In short, children don't just bond with parents and caregivers, they also bond with communities and culture. Currently, only 23% of children in foster care in the state of Maryland are placed with kin. We can and we will do better. House Bill 1499 prioritizes important childhood bonds, including those found by blood or by marriage, when considering the best interests of children who require an out-of-home placement. In 2023, the federal government issued a new licensing rule authorizing a different set of standards for licensing kinship caregivers and encouraging state agencies to adopt a broad definition of both relative and kin. House Bill 1499 will clarify the definition of kinship in the state, clarify the definition of kinship caregiver in the state by including relations through blood, marriage, tribal law or custom, or cultural custom or practice. It will also provide a policy preference for placement with kin, so Maryland children in out-of-home placements can benefit from family and cultural ties. Maryland has significant opportunities to increase kinship placements, improve support for kin families, and improve guardianship permanency outcomes. In fact, one of the ways that we can proactively, may I finish, sir? A few more sentences. In fact, one of the strategic ways that we can proactively address racial disproportionality in Maryland's child welfare system, is by investing in and believing that kin can care for their families. The same belief in kin will help us turn around the current fact. Nearly twice as many older youth age out of foster care in Maryland as compared to national data. In Maryland, when children enter foster care as teens, they are 40% less likely to reunify with family as compared to national data. Research reminds us that it is kin who have the potential to turn this around. For far too long, our nation and this state prioritized placing children in stranger care over doing the work of structurally and financially investing in kin. Together, we will change this policy and practice to better serve Maryland's children and families, and we urge your favorable report of HB 1499. I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr.
Certainly.
Secretary. So I'm actually a big fan of this policy. We've tried for a couple of years to get a bill through that does something similar to this. The only thing I'm wondering about, and I see in here you've included this tribal law, custom, or cultural custom or practice. some of the children that are taken into care are coming in because of some of the abusive behaviors at home are actually deeply entrenched in cultural norms. And
Mhm.
so I'm just wondering, is there any protection that you're imagining putting in place to make sure that a child who's suffering because of a failure of a cultural norm that hasn't translated well to our way of treating children doesn't continue based off of this kinship care concept?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Delegate. The quick answer is yes. The more nuanced answer is that every single child that is ultimately removed or that is required to be removed from their home for safety reasons, we would address the placement on a case-by-case basis. There is no way to unilaterally say that a particular family or a particular individual has the right sort of mix or formula. It's in partnership with local departments of social services and the courts who will make the decision based on the best interest of the child. We also looked, for example, to what many argue is the gold standard of care around the Indian Child Welfare Act, and basically understand what it looks like to make sure that we are lifting up and honoring best practices in terms of custom and practice. However, the research reminds us that this ultimately will have better results and outcomes for kids. And when we think about reducing frequency of abuse of any family member, we want to make sure that things like visitations are conducted properly and safely. Those would happen, again, as mandated by the courts in partnership with local departments of social service. Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too support this policy. And in fact, just want to tell you a quick story that my husband and I took in two of my cousins because they were homeless with their mom going from place to place. But we didn't go through this process. We didn't go through the actual, foster. We could have, and we were encouraged to do so, but I was a little hesitant to do it. So I guess I'm just wondering from you, what may have been the advantages now that this law is changing for me to have gone this route potentially than just, I've had the kids, they're now, 20 and 21. So
yeah,
they've done well and I'm very proud of them. And I really feel like they're my children. But just what's your perspective?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Delegate. I'm happy to answer a little bit give some context and maybe a window into our future, because it will take some time to turn this practice around. So 3 of the 5 of us staff members here all have lived experience with this exact similar situation. Many of you at this dais, I imagine, have a story of yourselves, your aunties, your grandmothers, your parents taking in family, not because it was required by law, but because of what you do for your people. Similarly, most of these arrangements are informal in nature and generally don't go before a court of law. However, they become your children, your family. The advantage might be, for example, that the way in which we've invested as a nation in structuring compensation, in structuring investment of development opportunities, of increasing the way in which we think about respite care and others when we might have a really bad day or a bad week, all those opportunities are not available to Maryland adults and families who want to take in kin. Or, for example, if I'm not married, if this person is not related to me by marriage or by blood, it's harder. Just recently, a group of us were at an event here in Annapolis as the legislature was kicking off, and we met an extraordinary young man who's a lawyer now by training, and he described the story publicly and to us privately of being an alumnus of Maryland's foster care system. He had wanted to take in his younger siblings, and he was at 18 years old at the time, was in college, and was forbidden by Maryland state law to do so. So the idea is, how might we reimagine how we use the law not to break up or maintain separation of families, but how do we use it to encourage strengthening families and make sure that we're expanding the most expansive ways to think about that, not just in terms of financial resources, but the way in which we treat the investment in kin and families. That would be an example, certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in to testify on this bill. Can you give me an example of what you would describe as cultural abuse?
Can you point to the exact reference
Well, earlier you all talked about there could be some abuse based on people's culture.
Oh, no, I didn't say that, sir.
No, I know you
you.
didn't. I didn't say that you said that.
Got you. Understood.
But I don't have permission
Oh,
to
sir. Oh,
refer
understood,
to
sir.
what another
Understood.
delegate
No,
might have said.
understood.
Do you understand?
I understand you very well, sir. Well, one makes mistakes. I thought, God forbid I said that, because I don't believe that. So let me go back to the science. The science worldwide tells us that violence in particular is not a cultural norm. And why that matters is that we oftentimes confuse aggressive or abusive behavior with our own cultural ties. Unfortunately, these things are learned. And so, for example, we would want to think about in this context that we would, trying to think of how to explain this, that particular communities or particular cultures or races are more violent than others. That is actually something that people believe in this country. And it's not based in fact. It's based in opinion and myth. And so what we want to make sure we do is that we value every family for who they are and provide supports for every family. To the previous delegate's question, however, in an instance, if, for example, I was removed from my family and placed, say, with my uncle or auntie, right? And the person who abused me was my father, the court would decide whether or not my father could have visitation rights with me as their biological child, even though I was placed with kin, my uncle and aunt. So the court would most likely in that instance say, Mr. Lopez Sr. could not spend time with Junior only because of a particular instance into which that child was removed into foster care. That would be like the most simple and clean example without going into the other nuances. And I think I heard your question correctly. And if I didn't get it correct, please correct me.
Maybe I didn't say it correctly.
Sure.
So would you say that corporal punishment could be the same as abuse? And some cultures believe, let's say, maybe in beating a child with a belt or with a switch or with a extension
Understood.
cord or et
Understood.
cetera, et cetera.
Understood. So I'm going to go back to what the court example. There are many ways in which, let me back up 2 notches, because I think it's important. The work of child welfare, whether it's in Maryland or the nation, is complicated when we're talking about humans. We are all raised in very different ways. And some of us grew up in situations where corporal punishment was typical, right? That said, it is not the decision of DHS. The court makes that choice based on the evidence presented to them when and if they separate a child from their family. And so rather than go to the nuance of corporal punishment is more consistent in community X or race X or culture Y, we would say, depending on what happens to that child, abuse, if found, would be a potential reason for removal from the family.
Then the court would have to decide what is the meaning of abuse.
That's correct.
Right.
That's
Okay.
correct. And so, for example, in this case, the state of Maryland has definitions on the books that judges will follow. For another example might be, and this is the world in which we live, the team behind me and myself receive every single day, all day long, reports of particular kinds of abuse and neglect across the state, every single day. The question often finds, once the investigation is conducted, what does the preponderance of evidence tell us about what happened? For example, was a shoe thrown and nicked a child's ear, or was a belt taken to the child and left belt marks on a child's leg? Those kinds of scenarios are part of what we, this nation and this state, deal with. And so if there is a case being made for removal, it wouldn't simply be that, me, social worker on my own, get to make the decision. There'd have to be evidence presented to the court, because one would argue that the removal of a child from their family is one of the most egregious things that can happen and most traumatic things that can happen to that child. And lots of people, I imagine at this dais, have very different opinions about what they would tolerate or not regarding to the way in which one disciplines or not a child. Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Secretary. Thank you for bringing this bill. I grew up in a household where I have parents, good church-fearing folks, where we always had people who ended up staying with us, sometimes for months, sometimes just for a couple of days. And I don't know that this would apply to the things that they did, but I think it's important. My question is this: how often does kinship care lead to potentially adoption or more formal guardianship? Because I think that permanency is the thing that we're looking for.
That's exactly right. So thank you for the question, Delegate. Let me approach it from a couple of ways and see if I capture this way. So as of today, there are 3,768 children in the care of the state of Maryland across all 24 jurisdictions. When we think about how we break down the data for placements with relatives, for example, There are two things I particularly look for. One is a total number, about 941 children in relative care of that total number. And then I look at 0 to 5-year-olds. And why do I look at that? Because when the international research is compelling around the development of neurons in the human brain. It's the most significant development of human brain development. If we can make sure a child has a permanent home and family during those years, we are setting them up for even more success later in life. However, that said, and when I mentioned earlier around needing to change how we encourage people by practice and policy to look at kin and family. So I look at that earlier, those numbers 0 to 5, and I look at what's happening in Maryland by the facts. So we, for example, age out nearly twice the national average of teens in the state. One of the answers to stop doing that is to find family and kin earlier on. When we don't have a practice and a norm across the state to say that kin are viable, and we have a practice to hold ourselves accountable to do that, then we end up having a system that we have today, which ages out more teens. And very specifically, I want to name it, it is actually Black teen girls in the state. And the question is, how do we get there? How do we turn that around? We turn it around with kin. That's not just my personal or professional perspective, that's what the research tells us, which is that kin have to be seen as a viable resource for kids. So for example, today in Maryland, I can't, on a laptop, anywhere at DHS, just automatically use technology to find kin. We might do a checkbox around whether we do that first check at stage 1, but what about a couple months into it? How we use technology to find people differently. We live in the DMV region. So your auntie might live in DC, but you might live in Baltimore County, just a few minutes away, and might have a relative in Virginia. Why would we have to struggle so hard in Maryland to look at those 3 states as a viable place for kin? I know that because when we look at the data for our teens who are aging out, many of them have kin. And so how might we, the state of Maryland, be much more proactive and aggressive about exploring every single option? So that's the first option of choice, not the last resort. Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Delegate Secretary Lopez, for being here today with such a heartfelt bill. And also thanks for a bayonet sign over there.
Yes, we did.
That's very nice of you. This is of tremendous interest of me, and it sparked my creativity. If this is successful, could your office potentially team up with the Department of Juvenile Services to offer some sort of alternative sentences for juveniles? And the reason I say this is, as a juvenile offender, it was offered to me to relocate with a relative, but it was denied. I think that could potentially produce some long-term positive results in our battle against juvenile crime. If this has such a positive impact upon our juveniles in the foster system, does it also have the potential to have the positive impact upon our juvenile offenders?
I think the quick answer, Delegate Bouchard, is yes. I would argue, though, that what we would all need to do is imagine a Maryland and a nation that so dramatically reduces the total number of kids in care in either system that we don't have to have that problem. And that's where I want to have our department help lead the way in partnership with Secretary Schiraldi. And I think that also has to do with how we see our young people, particularly the teens. The practices and norms sometimes see them as broken and not worthy of the same kind of investment of young children 0 to 5 years of age. More children 0 to 5 get adopted, both in Maryland and in the nation, than any other age group. That's not acceptable. Every child deserves a home, and every child deserves a family, whether by blood or by choice. And so I think when we do this well, we will have system-wide impacts that will both reduce the number of kids in care and increase the options so that children, young people like yourself, would have had that option available to them.
Thank you, Secretary.
Certainly.
For this with me, please
Sure.
contact my office.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Seeing no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That concludes the test. Oh, sorry. Do I have another person? Oh, I'm sorry. Aubrey Edwards-Luce, please come on up.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Aubrey Edwards-Luce. I am a resident of Prince George's County, Maryland, and the Executive Director of the Sarah and Neil Meyerhoff Center for Family, Children, and the Courts at the University of Baltimore School of Law. CFCC envisions communities where children and families thrive without unnecessary legal system involvement. And we urge you to support HB 1499, a bill that will make Maryland a premier kinship first state with provisions that advance both the best interest of children while also respecting parental rights. I appreciate that the committee will take time to read my written testimony, which I will make sure to supply this afternoon. But I wanted to use the rest of my time today to go beyond what I shared in writing. I'm a hidden foster care convictive kinship caregiver. Years ago, after CPS responded to a hotline call involving my goddaughter, we were given the choice to have her come stay with us or to go into foster care. And we chose to have her stay with us and not become licensed foster care parents, in part because of an issue that HB 1499 addresses, namely the lack of a clear kin first placement preference. Having represented children in DC's foster care system as a guardian ad litem attorney, I knew that if we had become my goddaughter's licensed foster care parents, her mother would surrender the authority to be able to decide whether she stays with us or goes to another kin or relative caregiver. Placement power would instead reside with an agency that might have biases against us or just disagree and not see us as the best placement for our goddaughter. And while HB 1499 does not go as far as to remove that placement power to the courts, it does address this concern by giving preference to kinship caregivers and to caregivers identified by parents. If Maryland enacts HB 1499 and other kinship first policies and regulations that hold agencies accountable to finding and placing children with their kin, I anticipate that we will move towards having the majority of children in DHS custody and kinship placements. I was recently asked what are the biggest barriers to moving towards this approach, and CFCC stands ready to work with this body to help identify those barriers. Thank you.
Questions? Seeing none, we thank you both very much for being here today. And that now concludes the testimony on House Bill 1499. We're going to go directly into a hearing with Brad Fallon now on House Bill 693. So we have to switch. We can't just keep going.
And Mr. Chair, if it's all right with